All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're taking a closer look at, well, you could say it's a pretty interesting period in English history and literature.
Indeed, a fascinating era, to
It-
say the least.
Exactly, the comedy of manners during the English Restoration.
Right.
And, well, our listeners are always looking to grasp quickly and thoroughly the key elements of these periods and the plays that came out of them.
Absolutely, and that's what we aim to provide.
Yeah, a sort of, well, a shortcut to the insights that truly matter. And today's deep dive is no exception. We're diving headfirst into this world, full of wit, social intrigue, and you could even say a touch of scandal.
You could indeed.
So we have an excerpt from an article titled, appropriately enough, comedyofmanners.pdf.
Yeah,
And our mission today is to unpack, to really get to the heart of the most significant and hopefully engaging aspects of this style of theater.
that's right.
And also, importantly, how it mirrored the sometimes tumultuous, society that emerged after the monarchy was restored.
Precisely. We're looking at both the theatrical style and the social context that shaped and influenced it.
Exactly. It's all connected, right?
Absolutely.
So let's start with the Restoration itself, 1660. This was, clearly a major turning point. Our source calls it an important event, having a, quote, wonderful impact on English life and literature.
A pivotal moment, no doubt.
But, reading between the lines, it doesn't sound like the king's return magically solved every problem.
No, not at all. While the return of the monarchy did mean the reopening of theaters, which of
Right.
course had been closed under Puritan rule, the article also hints at a society still grappling with some, well, let's say, significant issues. It actually refers to it as a diseased society.
Oh, wow. Diseased, that's a strong word.
It is, and it really underscores the pervasiveness of certain problems like indecency, immorality, corruption, and dishonesty, as the article puts it, affecting various levels of life. This societal hangover, if you will, from the previous era directly fueled the satirical bite of the comedy of manners.
I see. So it wasn't just about pure entertainment. These plays were holding up a mirror to, well, maybe even critiquing the times.
Exactly. Playwrights were using the stage to lampoon the very indecency and immorality that were so prevalent, offering a critical, albeit humorous, commentary on the superficiality and moral failings of the elite, particularly.
That makes a lot of sense. So with this societal shift, we also see a shift in the literary world. The article talks about a sudden break from old standards and ideals. What did that look like? What changed?
Well, our source highlights a really significant shift in literary influence. After the Restoration, English literature, particularly drama, was heavily shaped by French literary tastes and models, especially by the comedies of manners that French dramatists were writing at the time.
So there was a real cross-cultural exchange happening.
Absolutely, this was a golden age for French authors, and their comedic style really provided a blueprint, in a way, for the English playwrights of the Restoration.
Interesting. So it wasn't just a homegrown phenomenon, this comedy of manners. It had some deep roots in French theater.
That's right.
And from this mix, this blend of a changing society and this French influence, we get what the article calls the greatest literary force of the Restoration, the comedy of manners.
A bold statement.
It is.
But when you consider the sheer popularity and the lasting impact of playwrights like Congreve, Vanbrugh, Dryden, and Wycherley, you can understand why the article makes that claim. Their comedies dominated the theatrical scene and really captured the spirit of the age.
All right, so we have the when and the why. But for someone coming to this completely fresh, what exactly defines a comedy of manners? What should they be looking for?
The comedy of manners is a comedic genre that flourished, as we said, during the English Restoration. It's typically set in the sophisticated, often raucous world of the upper class, primarily in London.
So think grand houses, fashionable gatherings, the pursuit of social status.
Precisely. And at its core, the genre uses satire to poke fun at the vanities and the artificiality of this social circle. It's about exposing their pretensions and hypocrisies through wit and keen observation.
So how can our listeners tell if they're watching a comedy of manners?
The article points to several key elements. First, the witty dialogue. The characters are constantly engaged in verbal sparring, trying to outdo each other with clever retorts and sophisticated turns of phrase. Then there are the plots, often intricate and fast-paced, full of misunderstandings and surprising revelations.
Lots of twists and turns.
You could say that. And crucially, these plays offer a commentary on the social customs and moral codes of the time. They explore, in often quite cynical ways, the relationships between men and women, with marriage frequently being a target of satire.
So not exactly a genre known for its deep character development.
That's right. The article notes a relative lack of deep characterization. Instead, playwrights relied on recognizable stock character types, the fool, the schemer, the hypocrite, and so on, thrown into these intricate social games. It's more about how these types interact within specific social situations than about their inner lives.
It's interesting that these stock characters have roots in earlier comedic traditions, even going back to ancient Greek plays.
That's right. And closer to the Restoration period, you see clear connections to Molière's 17th century French comedies, which, as we mentioned, were a major influence on English writers. You can also see the influence of Ben Jonson's humorous plays, which focused on characters driven by a single dominant trait or humor, like excessive vanity. This idea of characters defined by their social affectations carried over directly into the stock characters of the comedy of manners.
So we've got these stock characters, witty dialogue, and a focus on social satire. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of what the article calls this exciting and boisterous period in theater after the theaters reopen. For those who aren't familiar with the history, why was the reopening such a big deal?
Well, just imagine, no public theater for almost 20 years. The Puritan government had shut them all down in 1642, so the reopening in 1660, with the restoration of Charles II, was a huge cultural event. Our source really emphasizes Charles II's personal love for entertainment, women, and especially theater as a major driving force behind this theatrical resurgence. He was a big supporter of the arts.
So the king himself was a bit of a theater fan, and his tastes definitely influenced what was popular.
Absolutely. And it's also important to note that the audiences for these plays were predominantly aristocratic.
Okay. A more homogenous group than you might have seen in earlier periods?
Exactly. Now, while comedy was undoubtedly the dominant genre of the Restoration, it's worth remembering that serious drama was also being produced.
Right. Playwrights like Dryden and Otway, for example.
Precisely.
Okay, so the stage is set, the audience is ready. Let's talk about the playwrights who really defined this genre, the big names. The article gives us a great list to work with.
It does. The central figures are George Etheridge, William Wycherley, John Vanbrugh, William Congreve, and George Farquhar. These are the names that are synonymous with the comedy of manners.
And it sounds like Etheridge was one of the first to really make a mark.
Yes, his plays, The Comical Revenge, or Love in a Tub from 1664, and She Would If She Could from 1668, are often seen as inaugurating the genre.
And he introduced some of those iconic stock characters.
He did. Characters like Sir Frederick Frolic, the witty rogue, and Sir Fopling Flutter, who's ridiculously fashionable. They were incredibly popular and really established those stock types we talked about, the charming rake and the foppish dandy, obsessed with appearances.
Okay, so Etheridge sets the stage. Then we have Wycherley, whose style is described as pointed and relatively harsh. That sounds like a bit of a different tone from the lighter wit we might associate with this genre.
You're right. Wycherley's comedies definitely have a sharper, more cynical edge to them. Take The Country Wife from 1674, for example. It tackles themes of jealousy and infidelity with real bite. The article even points out that an affair in the play is presented as almost proper and understandable because of the husband's abusive behavior.
Wow, that gives you a sense of the sometimes morally ambiguous world these plays depict.
It does, and his masterpiece, The Plain Dealer from 1676, based on Molière's Le Misanthrope, further delves into these darker aspects of human interaction, offering a more critical view of society than some of his contemporaries.
So, Wycherley brings a bit more darkness to the genre. Then we have Congreve, considered by many to be the greatest wit of all these dramatists.
He's often lauded for the sheer brilliance of his language. William Hazlitt, the famous essayist, even called Congreve's dialogue brilliant and his style perfect.
High praise indeed.
It is. Plays like The Old Bachelor from 1693 and Love for Love from 1695 were huge successes. Interestingly, his last comedy, The Way of the World, now often considered his masterpiece, wasn't as well received initially.
Really? Why not?
Well, it's from 1700, and perhaps the audience wasn't quite ready for its more complex plot and sharper satire on the social maneuvering around marriage.
Interesting. So, what made The Way of the World so different?
While marriage is still central, the focus shifts somewhat from purely romantic entanglements to the more pragmatic, sometimes cynical, aspects of securing a good match, financially speaking.
It's more about contracts and negotiation than about love.
Exactly. This more realistic, less idealistic portrayal of marriage might have been a bit too much for audiences looking for pure escapism and witty banter. But its intricate language and sharp social observations have earned it lasting acclaim. The proviso scene, for instance, brilliantly illustrates the power dynamics and the business-like negotiations that underpin many marriages of the time, all delivered with Congreve's signature wit.
So Congreve pushes the boundaries a bit. Next up is Vanbrugh, the relapse, or Virtue in Danger. The title itself sounds dramatic.
It does, and the play lives up to it. It's full of seduction, infidelity, mistaken identities, and characters chasing wealth, all woven into two interconnected storylines.
Quite a tangled web.
Indeed. And his other major work, The Provoked Wife from 1697, actually stirred up quite a bit of controversy due to criticisms about its perceived immorality. It seems these playwrights weren't afraid to tackle potentially scandalous subjects.
Definitely pushing the envelope.
They were. And as the article points out, even the character names in Vanbrugh's plays often reflect their personalities. Heartfree, the cynical bachelor, and Sir John Brute, the, well, brutish husband. It's another way that stock character approach comes into play.
Okay, Vanbrugh brings the drama. And finally, we have Farquhar, who seems to represent a bit of a turning point, according to the article.
That's right. Our source suggests that Farquhar's comedies, written towards the end of the Restoration period, show a greater sensitivity to characters as individuals rather than just types.
Show a bit more depth, a bit more nuance.
Exactly. Plays like The Recruiting Officer from 1706 offer a more nuanced satire of military figures, and The Beau's Stratagem from 1707 even features what the article calls a remarkably modern-style divorce based on the couple's genuine unhappiness.
So there's a shift away from the purely cynical towards a more, well, sympathetic, though still comedic, exploration of relationships.
Yes, you could say that.
And it's worth noting that the comedy of manners didn't just disappear after the Restoration. Later playwrights, like Sheridan with The School for Scandal and Goldsmith with She Stoops to Conquer, revived and reimagined the genre in the late 18th century, showing its enduring appeal.
Absolutely. Those later successes demonstrate the lasting influence and the adaptability of this style of witty social commentary.
It's fascinating to see that evolution. All right, so we've met the key players, explored some of their most famous works. Now let's dig deeper into the defining features of the comedy of manners.
Sound good.
The article highlights several important features, and one that jumps out is that the action always takes place in London. Why is the setting so significant?
Well, it underscores the genre's laser focus on the social world of the upper class in the capital city. London was the center of it all: fashion, politics, social life, and these plays were deeply embedded in that specific environment. The wit, the concerns, the targets of satire, they all stemmed from this very specific locale.
So it's not just any city, it's London, the heart of it all. The article also mentions a recurring contrast between the rural and the urban in these plays. How does that typically play out?
A good example is Congreve's The Way of the World.
Okay, one of the masterpieces of the genre.
It is. The character of Squire Witwoud arrives in London from the countryside, and his old-fashioned manners and lack of social polish make him a constant target of mockery by the more sophisticated London characters.
So it's the city slickers versus the country bumpkins.
In a way, yes. This contrast reinforces the perceived superiority of urban life and the perceived backwardness of the rural gentry in the eyes of the London elite, who were, of course, the primary audience for these plays.
Right, it's all about those very specific social codes and expectations of the London scene. Another feature the article mentions is the presence of, quote, at least one pair of very intelligent young lovers. What's their function in these comedic dramas?
They often serve as the witty protagonists, navigating the treacherous social landscape with their intelligence and verbal dexterity. Their witty banter and strategic maneuvering, whether it's for romantic or social gain, are central to the comedic action.
So they're the ones we're supposed to root for, amidst all this cynicism and social maneuvering.
You could say that. They often represent a more genuine connection, a glimmer of true love, in a world where relationships are often transactional or superficial.
Right, so they provide a bit of hope, a bit of heart amongst all the satire.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about the most defining characteristic of the comedy of manners: witty dialogue. The article really stresses this as being the most important feature.
And for good reason. The brilliance of the language, the cleverness of the wordplay is often the main attraction. The characters are constantly trying to outshine each other with their sharp remarks, their elegant insults, their sophisticated wordplay.
It's a verbal battle of wits.
Precisely. And sometimes the plot, even the characters themselves, take a backseat to the sheer brilliance of the language. The primary goal was to entertain and impress the audience with linguistic fireworks.
So it's all about those clever one-liners, those sharp exchanges.
To a large extent, yes. The article even suggests that other aspects of the play were sometimes sacrificed to create more opportunities for witty dialogue. The appeal was primarily to the audience's intellect rather than their emotions.
Engage the mind, not the heart.
You could put it that way.
And this wit could get a bit, well, risque, couldn't it?
It could. The article notes that the witty dialogue was usually obscene.
Obscene, that's pretty strong.
It is. But remember, this was a time of newfound freedom after the Puritan era, and playwrights certainly pushed the boundaries. They incorporated sexually suggestive language, double entendres, innuendo, all part of the game.
It was a way to titillate the audience, to reflect the more, shall we say, libertine attitudes of the Restoration Court.
Exactly. This focus on wit and clever wordplay extended to risque subjects, reflecting the more permissive atmosphere that followed the puritanical era. It was part of the overall spirit of the times.
It's also interesting that the women in these plays are often described as very emancipated and bold and independent.
Yes, that's a key aspect that sets them apart from the more sentimental heroines of later periods. The Restoration stage provided a platform for strong female characters who could hold their own in these witty verbal battles, and often wielded a significant degree of agency, particularly in matters of love and marriage.
They're not just sitting around waiting for men to make decisions for them.
Not at all. They're active participants in the social games and often match the men in terms of intelligence and cunning.
It's important to note that even though these women were often portrayed as strong and witty, they were still operating within a patriarchal society.
Absolutely. The plays don't shy away from showing the limitations placed upon women, even as they celebrate their wit and intelligence.
It's a complex portrayal, reflecting the complexities of the time. Now, speaking of marriage, the article states that the institution of marriage was always held to ridicule in these plays.
That's right. There's a lot of cynicism about marriage, and the plays often depicted the realities of arranged marriages, where love and personal happiness were often secondary considerations. Dissatisfaction within marriage was a common theme, as was the pursuit of pleasure outside of marital bonds.
So these plays weren't exactly promoting traditional family values.
Not necessarily. As the article puts it, continuity in love, especially in marriage, was boring. The Restoration elite often saw marriage as a social and economic contract, not necessarily a romantic union.
So commitment was seen as unexciting and variety was the spice of life, at least in these plays.
You could say that. And while sex itself wasn't explicitly shown on stage, the temptation of it, the intrigue surrounding it, were constant themes. The plays often imply that love thrived on variety, on clever manipulation, though genuine emotional connection was often absent.
A rather cynical view of love and marriage.
It is, but it reflects the attitudes of a particular segment of society at a particular time.
And that segment, as the article reminds us, was the elegant and sophisticated audiences of London City, with the characters almost always belonging to the upper class. So it was a very specific social world being both depicted and satirized. But how could these plays be satirical without completely alienating their upper class audience?
That's a great question. The playwrights had to walk a fine line. They could poke fun at the follies and affectations of the upper class, their obsession with fashion, their superficiality, their hypocritical attitudes, but they couldn't be too critical.
Right, they couldn't bite the hand that feeds them.
Exactly. The obscenity in the dialogue, as the article calls it, was often a part of the wit, a way to be suggestive and titillating without launching a full-scale moral attack.
It's about entertainment, not revolution.
Precisely. And the satire was often directed at individual behaviors and social pretenses rather than condemning the entire upper class.
It's about poking fun, not tearing down the whole system.
Right. The article also touches on how country life was often portrayed as dull and unsophisticated, and how figures like clergy and professional men were often treated with indifference or even disdain.
So reinforcing the values and biases of that London elite.
Exactly. And the humor often came from seeing those who tried to deceive others get their comeuppance, or from ridiculing those stock figures we talked about, the fop, the pretender, the old trying to be young, the old man with a young wife.
Familiar comedic targets that wouldn't make the audience too uncomfortable.
Precisely. And don't forget the prologues and epilogues, which the article describes as being delivered in a Coarse, boisterous, and hilarious fashion.
Well,
These serve to frame the play and often address the audience directly, setting the tone and maybe diffusing any potential offense.
A way to say, don't take it too seriously, folks. It's all in good fun. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the visual and auditory aspects of these plays. The article goes into some detail about costume, voice, and movement in Restoration comedy. It sounds like these elements were just as important as the script itself.
They were. The costumes, for example, were incredibly elaborate, reflecting the fashion of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. For men, think large hats with feathers, heavy wigs, formal coats, waistcoats, those wide, stiff cuffs. Women wore dresses with big skirts and sleeves, often with those high headdresses called mantillas and veils. It was very formal, very visually striking style.
It sounds almost like a uniform of the upper class.
In a way, it was. And while it started out quite structured, fashion did evolve during this period. Men gradually started showing more leg, and women's attire became a bit more fitted, a bit more revealing.
So even in fashion, there was a loosening of restrictions.
You could say that, and both men and women used makeup quite extensively. False noses, beards, mustaches for certain characters, along with lots of powder, rouge, eyeliner, lipstick, even those beauty patches.
So a very artificial, theatrical aesthetic.
Absolutely. It was all about creating a certain image, projecting a certain persona.
And how did they sound? How did they move? And all this finery.
The ideal voice was described as brilliant and brittle, emphasizing clear articulation and the rapid-fire delivery of those witty lines. Tone was crucial for conveying emotions and intentions, and precise pronunciation was highly valued. Actors often underwent specific training in singing, dancing, posture, gesture, even how to walk gracefully in those elaborate costumes.
It sounds like a very codified and theatrical way of presenting oneself.
It was. Every gesture, every movement was often deliberate, laden with social significance. Men would kiss a lady's hand when leaving, hold their hands away from their bodies to show off their lace cuffs, carry handkerchiefs and walking sticks. Women had to balance those huge hats. They often carried muffs, sometimes to hide secret notes or objects, and they developed a very specific way of walking, a graceful glide, holding their dresses just so.
So much attention to detail, to every little nuance.
It was all part of creating that world of elegance and sophistication, even as the plays themselves often satirized those very qualities.
A fascinating paradox. And the article concludes by reminding us that all of this, the witty dialogue, the stock characters, the social satire, the elaborate costumes and performances, was a reflection of the contemporary social environment, where traditional moral principles were perhaps less emphasized, and people were more likely to be led by passion, often with a casual disregard for the sanctity of marriage vows.
Exactly. The comedy of manners, in all its witty and sometimes cynical brilliance, held up a mirror to the values, behaviors, and social dynamics of Restoration society. It captured a moment in time, a shift in attitudes, and a loosening of social constraints.
So, to sum it all up for our listeners, the comedy of manners is a fascinating genre that emerged from a unique historical context, the Restoration period, deeply influenced by French comedic traditions and sharply focused on the lives and follies of the upper class in London. It's characterized by its sparkling, witty dialogue, its cast of recognizable stock characters, and its often satirical, sometimes cynical, perspective on relationships and marriage. It gave us a brilliant generation of playwrights. Congreve, Wycherley, Vanbrugh, Etheridge, Farquhar, and its influence can still be seen in comedy today. Hopefully, this deep dive has given you a clear and engaging understanding of this significant period in English literary history.
Indeed. And with all that in mind, here's a final thought for you to ponder. Given the often sharp and satirical nature of these plays, how might they have actually played a role in shaping or reflecting the evolving social norms and attitudes towards marriage, relationships, and social behavior during the Restoration? What can this tell us about the enduring power of entertainment, particularly comedy, to both mirror and potentially influence the society that creates and consumes it? Perhaps exploring the works of these playwrights directly will offer even further insights.
A fantastic point to ponder. Until our next deep dive, keep those questions coming and keep exploring the fascinating world around us.